Dear honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to the MaMa Charitable Foundation Symposium in Buddhist Counselling, organized by the Center of Buddhist Studies of the University of Hong Kong. The theme of this two-day symposium is Instigating Insight into the Healing Process. We are truly grateful to the MaMa Charitable Foundation, the sponsor of the symposium this time, for its very generous and continuous support to us. With their contribution, an endowment fund has been established in HKU in 2012 for sponsoring Buddhist scholars in various fields to visit us and give lectures each year to promote knowledge exchange. Before the symposium begins, I'd like to invite Dr. Stephen J. Cannon, our university's Executive Vice President in Administration and Finance, to give the welcome speech. Dr. Cannon, please.
Thank you. Good morning. Mr. Kissy Leung, Venerable Kuan Yin, Mr. Walter and I, distinguished guests, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Steve Cannon, and I'm the university's Executive Vice President, which means I look after all the non-academic side of the business, if you like. The President, Professor Zhang, would very much have liked to have been here for longer this morning. He came and said hello to our distinguished guests, but he couldn't be here for long. He had another prior engagement. But there is a Chinese expression that says that on the mountain, when the tiger is away, then the monkey is king. And this morning you have the monkey. But it's a rather large monkey. So what we lack in quality, we make up for, I think, in quantity. My role this morning is short and very simple, and that's to welcome you all to the University of Hong Kong. In particular, I'd like to welcome Mr. Kissy Leung, Director of the MaMa Charitable Foundation, the sponsor of this event, the Venerable Kuan Yin, the President of Hong Kong Buddhist Association, and Mr. Walter Ai of the Qinghai Monastery, our co-organisers. With the generous support of the Foundation, the Centre for Buddhist Studies at Hong Kong U has appointed visitors professors to address different themes over periods of time. And this year, in addition to the lecture series, the Foundation has funded this symposium to promote a more in-depth study in the field of Buddhist counselling. This is a wonderful gesture, and I believe a vote of confidence in all that we're trying to do here at Hong Kong U. Mental health and well-being are important public health issues that demand the attention of society and the attention of serious academic study within the university. The university is uniquely placed to engage with this. It's a laboratory, a microcosm of society, a community in which each member of that community is valued or should be valued for who they are and what they do. And the success of the community, of the university community, is defined by the sum of all its parts and not just by the contribution of a few. All that we are is the result of what we have thought. The mind is everything. What we think is what we become. This symposium provides an excellent opportunity for our teachers and students to learn from world-renowned scholars, researchers, psychologists, medics, paramedics, social workers, psychotherapists, counsellors, and the general public. I am confident that all those who are fortunate enough to engage over these 2 days will gain remarkable insights from the symposium, and we will be able to take those insights with them into their professional and personal lives. Finally, I would simply like to say that here at Hong Kong U, we value enormously the partnership with the MaMa Foundation, the Buddhist Association, and the Monastery. If the university walks alone, it might go faster, but if we walk together, we'll walk further. Thank you very much and enjoy the symposium.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cannon. Please remain on stage for the souvenir presentation ceremony. As a token of gratitude to all our speakers, we would like to invite them to the stage to receive our souvenirs. Please join me to give a big hand to welcome them to the stage. They are Professor Padmasiri de Silva, the MaMa Charitable Foundation visiting professor in Buddhist Studies this year, who is also our keynote speaker in the symposium. Professor SHONIN from Nottingham Trent University. Dr. William Van Garden from University of Derby. Professor Elizabeth Lobb from University of Notre Dame. Professor Elaine Yun from Morocco University. Professor Samuel Wong from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Dr. Jennifer Yim from the Shan Monastery Buddhist Spiritual Counseling Center. Last but not least, the speakers from the Center of Buddhist Studies of HKU, including Wenbo Hin Hong, Wenbo Dr. Hin Yan, Professor Liang Tian, Dr. George Lee, and Ms. Bonnie Wu. And now I would also like to invite a few more guests to accompany Dr. Cannon to present souvenirs to our speakers. Please give a big hand again to welcome them to the stage. They are Mr. K.C. Leung, Director of the MaMa Charitable Foundation. Dr. Guang Xin, Director of the HKU Center of Buddhist Studies. Venerable Kuan Yun, President of the Hong Kong Buddhist Association, the co-organizer of the symposium. And Mr. Walter Ai, Secretary General of Shan Monastery, which is also the co-organizer this time. Thank you to all our speakers. Many of them travel all the way to Hong Kong to participate in the symposium this time. Thank you. Could we have another big round of applause to them? Thank you so much. You'll be able to learn from their wisdom in the coming 2 days. Thank you very much. Now we are going to take a group photo for all our guests and speakers. Please remain on stage. And I would also like to invite Mr. Albert De Rosa from the MaMa Charitable Foundation to join the group photo taking. Mr. De Rosa, please. We are very grateful to the support of all our speakers. Thank you so much. And once again, we would also like to express our gratitude to the generous contribution of the MaMa Charitable Foundation, without which the symposium would not be possible. So please join me to give a big hand again to all our speakers and guests. This is really memorable and happy moment. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. May I invite you all to be seated now. Thank you. Please be seated. Thank you very much for all our guests and speakers. Please be seated now.
Yeah, I'll send it. No problem. Okay. No.
Thank you. Please be seated. In the symposium today, we are very happy and honored to have invited Professor Padmasiri de Silva to be our keynote speaker. And before his presentation, I would like to invite Dr. George K.C. Lee, faculty member of our Master of Buddhist Counselling program, to introduce Professor de Silva to us. Dr. Lee, please.
Dr. Cannon, Mr. K.C. Leung, Venerable Guang Yun, Mr. Walter Nan, Professor De Silva, and all presenters and participants of the symposium, good morning. It is my great honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor De Silva. Professor De Silva received his MA and PhD in comparative philosophy from the University of Hawaii. He was a professor and the head of the Philosophy and Psychology Department of University of Paradelnia. He has published more than 10 books related to Buddhist counseling and Buddhist psychology and has multiple publications. He is known as the pioneer and leading scholar in the field of Buddhist counseling. I do want to share a little bit of my journey developing as an early Buddhist counseling scholar impacted by Professor De Silva. As I am young and early in this career, I was early trained as a clinical psychologist starting to learn Buddhism. And one of the first books I read about this field is this one, The Introduction to Buddhist Psychology and Counseling, written by Professor De Silva. This is one of the most engaging books that I ever read. To be honest, I'm not a very patient reader. It's very rare that I can finish the whole book in a very short time, especially when it's come to an academic book. But this is certainly one of them. While I was reading this book, 3 thoughts actually come up to my mind. At that time, I did not know who was Professor De Silva. The first thought was, okay, so this person or this book has such an in-depth way to articulate both psychology and Buddhism and able to draw new ground. Would it be a book that is compiled of a number of authors, an edited book? It's impossible to be written just by one person. And I checked the author's name again and for a few times. No, it's just one person. One person can have this wealth of knowledge in these 2 very difficult disciplines. Okay? And second, I was thinking, wow, this book is very trendy in our field. In Western professional psychology, we are just moving beyond mindfulness into integrating Buddhist teachings into psychotherapy and counseling. But this book has moved beyond mindfulness, and I think that, wow, this is something really new. And I checked that even though this version is from 2014, the first version was 40 years ago, meaning that this author has written something that is actually long, that has a long vision that we as psychologists are still catching up with. And finally, I was thinking, wow, all I have aspired to do, all things that I really want to do as a psychologist coming into Buddhism is basically done here. Should I just change a profession? Should I quit? Should I get another PhD in another field? But when I read this book on page 2011, I was engaging in self-conceit because attaching to the view that I'm inferior to others is a self-conceit, which helped me understand how my mind worked to see my desire and attachment. So, Professor De Silva, this is my great honor to present to you, to the audiences. This book have given me a lot of encouragement to pursue my dream to be a psychologist in Buddhism, especially in professional psychology, in my presentations, in my academic work. There are a lot of resistance from psychologists saying that, are you saying that Buddhism is better? Why are you not comparing? Do you have evidence? Like all those kind of things that I have to find a way to explain for. But your book gave me courage and inspirations and role model to me how to walk a path from psychologist to Buddhism to Buddhist counseling. I really thank you for that. And now, with great honor, I want to present our keynote speaker, Professor De Silva, to you. Please put your hands together to welcome him.
Are you born? First, I must express my deep sense of gratitude and appreciation for the tremendous honor that has been bestowed on me, and especially to come here as a special MaMa Foundation, visiting professorship to the University of Hong Kong, and also to give the keynote address for this symposium. And I thank Professor who introduced me. I'm so happy that this book has been a part of my life, and now it has gone around the world. Another, which you must probably read, is one of my just friends, Dr. Wong, got interested in, is Somatic Intelligence. That's my latest. So now I really had two hobbies. One, the study of human emotions, on which I have already given you 3 lectures. They are hobbies, and human emotions, all the ins and outs and the networks I have gone through, and I have promised to develop a course unit on human emotions and prepare a text for it in the coming years. My second interest came through pain management, not because it was an interesting subject, but because I had to go through it. So there is a lot of deep personal experience in my interest in pain management. And this has been developed under the term of somatic intelligence. Now, what is somatic intelligence? Howard Gardner wrote a groundbreaking book called Types of Intelligence, where he has said there are so many types of intelligence, including emotion, but intelligence of the body has been neglected. So this whole book is on the intelligence of the body, and pain management is only one of them. We are going into pain management, trauma, PTSD is a very complicated area. The body in alcoholism, and all these things have been there. So but all this have been fashioned according to long years of practice of Vipassana meditation under my guru in Sri Lanka, Venerable Dhammajiva of Mitrigala, to whom this book has been presented. So during the latter part of my talk, I will be going beyond mindfulness-based cognitive therapy to a thing called a vibration theory, which is product of Vipassana meditation. So now, mindfulness-based pain management and cognitive behavior therapy. A very wise thinker in Israel said, history teaches us that men and nations behave wisely when they have exhausted all other alternatives. So that is where people take to meditation. Today in the area of heart diseases, cancer, and mental health, mindfulness practice is used as a cornerstone for helping others for making healthy lives. So now I will present my study in stages. I will be referring to a text called the Satipatthana Sutta, which you may not get in discussions of cognitive behavior therapy. The Satipatthana Sutra is a very famous document. It was a sermon given by the Buddha centuries and centuries back to a village called Kuru, a market town where people meet, and these people, and large number of monks. And he said this Satipatthana Sutra at the end, by itself, is enough to take you to Nibbana. It's a very powerful document, which has been beautifully translated and edited by Venerable Analayo. If you are interested, try to get a copy of Analayo, the Satipatthana Sutra by Analayo. So when I refer to Satipatthana, I hope now you will understand why it's important. There has been a radical transformation of the Western psychological tradition, which was during modern times, except the Buddha's perennial insight. What did he say? He said, the severity of human suffering depends largely on our attitude to it. And as Sigmund Freud said, Buddha was merely converting hysteria into common unhappiness. So it's a philosophy of dukkha that he presented, and pain has to be understood against that background. Our relationship to emotional pain is a key factor in how much we suffer. For example, the latest wave of cognitive behavior therapy understands that trying to directly change our thoughts is less effective than creating a wide, open-hearted space for our experience. A less resistant, less avoidant relationship to our thoughts and feelings. This view is expressed in mindfulness-based therapy by the statement, thoughts are not facts. That is important. When these thoughts come, you look at as if they are facts. Today is a bad day. I am not feeling well. That is this problem. And so on, you go on. But then those are just thoughts. Those are not facts. Thus, opening out and creating a space is important. Second strand is acceptance. Now, there's a special therapy, ACT, which is based on the whole notion of acceptance. Curiosity, tolerance, willingness, and the ability to embrace pain with friendship, as presented in acceptance commitment theory, ACT. In fact, they don't even want to mention the similarity to Buddhism, but the similarities are there. ACT draws a distinction between pain and suffering. When we encounter painful content within ourselves, we want to do what we always do, fix it up and sort it out so that we can get rid of it. They emphasize the danger of experiential avoidance. And acceptance is not a heavy, sad, dark thing. It's an active, vital embrace. So you accept the fact that there is pain, then half the problem disappears. The third point is that the Buddhist perspective, while endorsing these two strands, considers very important capacities like attention. Attention is extremely important. Compassion, one of the key themes of this conference. And empathy are skills that can be learned rather than a product of good genes or a fortunate childhood. Christopher Germer has developed the idea of befriending painful feelings through self-compassion. These 3 points are at the heart of the Satipatthana according to Analyo's commentary. The contemplation of the mind does not involve active measures to oppose unwholesome states like anger or lust. Mind has to be receptively aware by clearly recognizing the state of mind that underlies train of thought. Buddha said, see lust as lust. If there is lust, seeing lust as light is an achievement. You don't have to worry your head that there is lust. But if you deny lust, then you have problems. See lust as lust, anger as anger. This is necessary as that a tendency to ignore that which goes against our self-importance. There's also another very important technique. There's a concept called Vanchaka Dhamma, that is deceptions. How do deceptions come? That day, for those who came, my talk on Sigmund Freud, I referred to something called, in fact, I didn't later use the word unconscious, but the word subliminal. So there are a lot of subliminal tendencies. Patiga, Anusaya, or anger is one subliminal tendency. Raga, Anusaya, one subliminal. So when you have pain, you might feel that lust is the solution. Or if you have pain, you might get thoroughly angered, and without knowing, because it's subliminal, the anger crops up. So this of lust, anger and conceit. Conceit is also, the Pali term is anusaya, subliminal tendency. Subliminal tendencies or lust, anger. Such hidden motives may be clearly seen at three levels. It can lie at the level of sleeping passions, your anger. Or it can come into your thoughts. Or it if it comes as action, then you become unruly. You become unruly. In Pali they say anusaya, parivrttana and vitikkamma. So there are these three levels. Then the fourth point is, if we look at anger or aversion of our pain as a purely negative emotion to be destroyed, we lose sight of the fact that for Buddhism, you can convert it into another term called hermeneutical. That is, you will use anger to understand that sensations emerge, stay for a while, and pass away. Anicca. So you see, you can convert that into a lesson. You look at your anger, which comes because of your pain, and then find, after all, what is it? My anger is something, sensation which comes, stay for a while, and pass away. So that is a little bit of magic. Venerable Jnanapurnika says that if you see aversion as aversion, lust as lust, do not judge them as good and bad, then it's possible to deal with them. This attitude keeps up resentment, guilt, and in neurological terms, the term is reactivity as different from resilience. So if you develop resilience, if you develop equanimity, if you develop understanding, neurologically there is a gain. Thus, both Buddhist contemplative practice and Western psychotherapy are twin parts to emotional healing. A fifth point is, we do not throw away negative emotions, as they can be transformed and by a little magic converted into their opposites, like patience and forgiveness. Also, especially according to the philosopher Nietzsche and the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, there is vital power in some negative emotion which can be harnessed. You get this concept in dialectical behavior therapy. I have written on this Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky. There's a person who kills a money lender, and later he develops complete compassion. He changes so that the good and the bad, they're all mixed up, they're found together. So this is the story of Angulimala, the robber thief who was trying to collect 100 fingers, and after having collected 99, he was going after the Buddha. This may be a story, but the idea is that change is possible. Transformation is possible. Any Angulimala can be changed and transformed. This is a very strong point in dialectical behavior therapy. So, anger and compassion, they can exist side by side. You don't get worried that there is anger, but I don't have compassion. I will briefly refer to three icons of pain management towards the end. One is, of course, John Kabat-Zinn. Other is a wonderful person called Vidyamali Birch, who in a wheelchair has written a complete book on the awakening of somatic intelligence, or it's called the breathwork treatment. Other one is a very, very tremendous Risa Caparo, who has written Awakening Somatic Intelligence. I will refer to them as I go on, especially the latter two. Now to come to the Satipatthana. The body scan practice in MBCT also involves direct experience of physical sensation, being with the body in the present moment. Be intentional about where and how it is placed. Deliberately engage and disengage as you move through the body. Relate skillfully to mind wandering and judging them. Allowing things to be as they are, relaxation instead of restlessness. MBCT is of course very well known. They also refer to something called autopilot thinking. That is, if you have pain, and if you want to really forget about it, it comes. It comes again. No, this problem is coming again. I did this, I did. So there is this autopilot always working through, and then our skills with practical activities have become our automatic repertoire. And this way of habitual problem solving has become automized. Often beyond our conscious awareness, the normal thinking mind is engaged in automatic activity. It's also referred to as rumination. Now we come to the second part on pain management. I'm skipping some of the earlier, but coming to pain management, this is extremely important. Traditional sensory physiology that dominated pain rituals was introduced by Cartesian dualism. That's a theory of the philosopher Descartes, that the mind and the body are separate. So it's this dualism which hindered a good understanding of pain. They look the body and mind as separate entities. According to this new pain, according to our pain is subjective and physical pain is invariably tied to emotions. Pain refers broadly to describe any unpleasant experience that has a physical dimension, whether caused by disease, injury, or stress. Pure pain is never directed as an isolated sensation. It's very important. Pure pain is never directed as an isolated sensation. Pain is always accompanied by emotion and meaning unique to each individual. There's a difference between primary pain and secondary pain. Secondary pain is really the problem. Secondary pain is beyond mere physical sensation, adding both physical and emotional responses. That is what we call stress, S-T-R-E-S-S. So when there is stress, it's not primary pain, it is secondary pain. Now, one of my friends who really, in fact, he launched this book, very famous medical faculty lecturer in Australia. Now, Craig Hassard says that the second layer to physical pain may be described as stress. Stress increases the outflow of inflammatory chemicals. We have poured fuel on the inflammatory fire. It makes things worse. Secondly, we may be physically tense and stressed, which may add to the muscle spasms. We may be always hypervigilant, thinking, oh, there is pain, there is pain, there is pain, there is pain. So, those are, that's not pain as a basic sensation. They are secondary things which we add. We sensitize the pain circuits of the brain. This may be an important reason, Craig Hassard says, why mindfulness is so therapeutic. For preoccupation about the pain and reduces the emotional reactivity of the chronic pain, as it helps to unhook attention from the preoccupation about the pain and reduces emotional reactivity. Stress seems to change the chemical composition of the nerve endings. So you see, the stress creates lots of things which we don't know. If you understand that, then you don't top your pain with stress. Why is this? Which is happening? It is very often when we have pain, we want to say, now how is it? How is it changed? Like that. If you go on a dialogue like that, there will be no end. Stress seems to change the chemical composition of the nerve endings, making them more liable to fire off pain messages. It is just the unconscious way we anticipate, react and respond. Craig has said Mindfulness of Life. It's a brilliant book which is very useful. Buddhism and mindfulness, adding emotional response to physical pain. Buddha is in fact saying, rather than being driven solely by the desire to eliminate suffering, the wise person learns to change the relationship to suffering. There's a very famous sutra called the Salleka Sutra. Salleka means darts. The Buddha says, man who develops equanimity to pain is only struck by one dart. The man who has pain, complains about it, is struck by two darts. So, secondary pain means physical pain is one dart, secondary pain is second dart. Salleka Sutra, which is also quoted by Vidyamali Birch. It's a beautiful summing up of what we add to our pain. When an ordinary person experiences a painful bodily feeling, they worry, agonize, and feel distraught. Then they feel two types of pain, one physical and one mental. It is as if this person was pierced by an arrow, and then immediately after, by a second arrow. That the second arrow excites your subliminal hunger or patiga answer. Now I would just like to pay tribute to Vidyamali Birch. Vidyamali Birch is one of the icons of pain management. She, while being on the wheelchair, she worked with the help of John Kabat-Zinn, a book called the Breathworks Program. Breathworks Program. Now that is a wonderful work, and I was greatly inspired by Vidyamali Birch. Other one is Risa Caparo, Awakening Somatic Intelligence. Now, Vidyamali Birch herself had several accidents, several problems with a disease, and year after year, she was struggling. And ultimately, with the help of John Kabat-Zinn, and now she is world famous, Breathworks Program. Other one is Risa Caparo's. It's a very interesting story. Risa Caparo was an artist who was trained to make a little playground for children. And she had to break through a lot of rock with a hammer. And while doing that, one day, the rock was so strong, the hammer went through her face outside. She suffered a great deal. It's a tremendous story. And then ultimately, when she was fairly normal, she was teaching art to a group of blind children. And then she discovered that these blind children are very sensitive to sounds. That was the first opening. Then she got interested in the sounds of the body. So that somatic intelligence, Risa Kapar is tremendous. She is influenced by Buddhism. Her favorite was Jiddu Krishnamurti. She had a lot of mystic literature around him. She embraced a lot of ideas in Buddhism also. It's called Awakening Somatic Intelligence, And my book got the title from her work, Awakening Somatic Intelligence, if you can read it. So, this Risa Caparo and Vidyamali births. Risa Caparo had nothing to do with John Kabat-Zinn, but Vidyamali had. Now, to my last section, which is a very difficult concept. That is where you go beyond John Kabat-Zinn. Now in the Buddhist meditation, this is called developing the sixth sense. I will explain. Now according to Venerable Dhammajiva of Mitrigala, who was trained for 3 years in Burma on the Vipassana tradition. Now this is, when you meditate, after a while, you find that the five senses bring information with the translation of the neural impulses to smell, taste, sound, and visual image. Now, what really happens was that the breath is called the strike element. When the breath touches the lips or the nose, that is solidity. So you get the air element, you get the solidity, and when it strikes, that's the fire element. So there is a vibration, they are called vibration patterns. The first is the air, the striker element. When you meditate, that pitch pushes. Then the point of the touch, the tip of the nose or the lips, that is solidity. Rubbing of the air draft on the nose or ignition, that is the fire element. And the last one is the moist elements of heatness and coolness. Now this one, it takes long time to practice Vipassana meditation and see all these patterns on the breath. The breath coming in, touching the lips, then there is ignition, and then passing off, and then throughout you get contraction and expansion, contraction and expansion. Now these called the theory of, they are not really elements, they are vibrations. Now if you practice this for a long time, in a very systematic way, you come to an experience called Kaya Sankara Passambhayam. It's a mystical state, or meditative contemplative state. That is, Kaya Sankara means all the, Sankara is the activities, all the activities that you have been doing throughout the time. Running here, doing this, doing that, shouting, making a living, cooking, whatever you have been doing. Now those activities, sublime, subdued, calm. Kaya Sankara, Kaya is body, Sankara is the bodily dispositions, calm down. Tremendous sense of calm, peace, so on. So that's and that is called non-sensory, because when you meditate, you don't see the world. So it's a state of the body, Kaya Sankara is bodily disposition. It's calming down. As the meditation develops, at least a minimum of about 45 minutes, the vibration patterns gradually display more refined qualities as the gap between the in-breath and the out-breath becomes smaller, more refined, roughness and softness, flowing, hot, cold, contraction, expansion. Out of these qualities, tightness and looseness. And you become a tremendous sensitivity to your bodily states. Now, if you had come for my emotion lectures, William James was the first one to say that when you have anger, body sensations emerge. When you have lust, body sensations. So the body sensations are important. And Risa Kampara is very powerful on this. seeing the body sensation. So you see, now, and this is called the breath body. So ultimately, with all these things which go to make the human being, you come to the breath body. Body and mind emerge together and fades off together. The tranquilization of the breath body generates the contemplative emotions of joy, piti. It's called piti in Pali. That's joy. There is sukha, well-being. This is called the sixth sense. It's extremely strange that a clinical psychologist like Satyayana, then Daniel Siegel, they have used the term interoception to describe this stage. So here's the point. Of course, they don't consider it as a mystical stage or whatever it is, but they find there's a tremendous amount of refinement in this state. And just a little minute. My recent work on pain management goes into embodied mindfulness and somatic intelligence. Now, somatic learning, as I said, can be a skillful means to transform pain, trauma, and so on and so on. But the most important is if you go into this vibration theory, then you get a more a deeper but very difficult. It's something that calls for years of practice. Then you develop a new understanding of the body. So according to Daniel Siegel, you can see a lot of body, you can feel a lot of things in the body. So, in fact, now for instance, mindfulness builds our resonance circuitry for enhanced compassion and empathy. Now that's really another aspect of it which I don't want to deal with it because there will be someone talking about compassion and empathy. Now Yana Suchi, a clinical psychologist, and Daniel Siegel and Risa Caparo accept the skills of interoception as a sixth sense and so on. So you see, this is a rather difficult idea, but I brought them because now this goes beyond mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. So, to round up my presentation, pain management was of interest to me, as I said, because you begin to understand the body. You became very, and as you develop, there are stages in the understanding of the body. Now, if you had followed the Charles Darwin, William James, Sigmund Freud, that controversy which we discussed. Now, Charles Darwin showed how when there is anger, it comes on the face. When there is fear, it comes on the face. It comes on the body. So this body is a tremendous treasure house for both the good and the bad. So anger, fear, sadness, they all, and here the nice thing is that it comes on the face. In fact, Charles Darwin studied a lot of engravings, pictures, photographs of people, and so on and so on. So he was the first person, 100 years back, to show the importance of the body. So it was a very early form of somatic intelligence. It's a body that is speaking through your face. It's a body that is speaking through your face. Your anger, your fear, your sadness. Sigmund Freud said, but beyond the body, there are what are called ideogenic passions. Your jealousy is not seen in your face. Not necessarily, but it's still complicated. So your envy, your jealousy, your melancholy, and all that sort of thing they are more dependent on, but they are called a cognitive theory. A cognitive theory. Thought patterns are so. That is where William James made a little mistake. He said, first you run and then you feel fear. First you cry and then you feel sad. I mean, it is true that the body reacts, but the thing is very often, first you have a ideogenic. You see someone's property, you find that he is doing better than you. Now that is really the work of the mind. So ideogenic passions and somatic passions, they have slightly different workup. Now, I mentioned this because the body is extremely important, and that is why in this book, I spent the whole book on the study of the body. Earlier it was called somatic psychology, now it is called somatic intelligence, and I have a separate chapter on, I was quite a little bit of an expert on alcoholism, and I had very good results for a number of them, using very simple techniques. So now, the Greeks call it the problem of acrosia. Acrosia means temptation. Why people get into temptation. Now there's a whole chapter on the study of the body in alcoholism. So the important thing is, I have tried my best in the last 3 lectures and today to focus on the body. Only thing is, my last part of the lecture is a bit controversial. I mean, because it's a very personal thing. So how can you develop through vipassana any additional contemplative states? And people don't talk about that, because that is, even from the monk, it's only if you go for a retreat and so long. So I got interested in, I'm going to finish up now, I got interested in what are called vibration patterns, which took me to music therapy. Now there is no time to sing, but I will give 1 or 2 examples from music therapy. Music therapy is very good for pain management, which I used on myself. I'll give you 2 examples. Now, one day in a retreat, I was so fascinated by the surroundings, the trees, the birds, and there's a little rocky drain through which water was passing, which reminded me of a little stanza which I learnt at the school. It went like this. Kini, kini, nadadana, diya khanda gala, mata vedi, kadi, mata rande kopur. This water is passing through a rocky drain. Kini, kini, nadadana, diya khanda gala, vedi, kadi, mata rande kopur. Sisi, sisi, amabimba, nadi, sisi, jala, Monaranga, the cool water is passing by. Now these vibrations associate with peace. And one more before I finish up, it's a song I composed called Morning Melodies, which I sing in the morning. It's on the flower Samang picture. It's a beautiful white flower, Sri Lanka must be knowing. It's on the blossoms of the Samang picture. Arunodaya is morning. Arunodaya me udavela samam pichamal suvandahama. Arunodaya me udavela samam pichamal suvandahama. Sumudu siriya sunima pokurupitim pipila kumudu sina. Kumudusina Arunodaya Udavela Samam Pichamal Suvandahama Sumudu Siriya Sunima Pogurupitim Pipila Iriya Vegirila Kandugati Siriya. Now the birds are going on migration. the second part. Beautiful. Iriyaven vagirila kandugati esriya mihiri sumiri gita gaya kurulurana, that is kurulurana visurigiya penatanak hoya penagamak hoya yana duragamana. The birds, after singing, they are going. They don't know where they are going. They are going to a no man's land. So those are two examples which I used on myself, you see. So musical vibrations, music is very often used in hospitals now. But you can generate your own musical rhythms of calm, of peace, of happiness, and so on. And we don't make use, because only problem is the popular music is in fact, the University of Hawaii, when I finished my PhD, we used to go to the Waikiki beach, and I give you just a little bit of what we sang, which is not too bad, right? We are going to the island of the Maui, in Lahaina, Lahaina, Luna, in Lahaina, in Lahaina, in Lahaina, Luna. The morning sunrise, the evening sunset, the shining starlight, in Lahaina, in Lahaina, in Lahaina, Lahaina, Luna. As I was arranging my suitcases to leave Hawaii. So these little things, which you can put in a good mood, and a lot of pain management you can handle. Thank you.
Thank you very much for Professor Da Silva's very remarkable keynote speech and the very special music therapy offered to us. Could we have another big round of applause to Professor Da Silva? Thank you so much. The next guest speaker that I would like to introduce is Professor SHONIN. He is a chartered psychologist and the co-founder of the Awake to Wisdom Center for Meditation and Mindfulness Research, which is based in Italy. He is also an internationally recognized leading authority in research and practice of Buddhist meditation, who sits on the editorial board for numerous academic journals. He has over 100 academic publications related to mindfulness and Buddhist meditation, with some of them published in the world's leading medical and psychology journals. The topic that he'll present today is Ontological Addiction Theory, a new psychological model of human functioning. So without further ado, please join me to give a big hand to invite Professor SHONIN to begin.
I'm just doing a trial and error here. Let's see if my glasses are any good. Yeah, they seem to be okay. Can everyone hear me fine from this position? Good, good. Okay, I'm going to talk about this new psychological model of human functioning that we have developed. It's called Ontological Addiction Theory. I like to think that this theory is perhaps the mother of all other addictions. I would like to begin with a poem, actually, that myself and my colleague, William Van Gordon, Dr. William Van Gordon, wrote some time ago. This summarizes, perhaps, underpins the concept, a very complex concept, of attachment to self, ontological addiction. If you don't mind, I will read it. Like the repose that follows when waking from a nightmare, like the reprieve of an isolated general who recognizes the encroaching soldiers as his own troops, like the relief that arises when realizing that the snake on the road was, all along, just a piece of old rope. Like the rapture of the despairing treasure hunter who returns home to find the riches actually buried beneath their own home. O self, who has enslaved me for so long, having seen that you are empty of any inherent existence, I have shed the shackles of ignorance and entered the non-returning blissful abode. This is a new theory that we have developed, but it has received a lot of attention by the national and international media. It's a novel metaphysical model of human functioning. But it's not just a theory. It is also a discrete condition that I'm afraid to say perhaps the majority of the world's population suffers from. Ontological addiction, we have defined it as the unwillingness to relinquish an erroneous and deep-rooted belief in an inherently existing self, or an I, as well as the impaired functionality that arises from such a belief. Ontological addiction theory underlies the training model used in some second-generation mindfulness-based interventions, such as meditation awareness training, which I and my colleague, Dr. William Van Gordon, developed some time ago. In general, the psychological sciences, psychiatry, rely principally on what is called the biopsychosocial model. The DSM-5 vaguely acknowledges the importance of spiritual practice. In fact, it's actually a code. So it's stated that other conditions that may be a focus of clinical attention. However, ontological addiction theory emphasizes the importance of psychospiritual factors, spiritual practice, and what is this? Spiritual practice helps to transcend the attachment to self, helps to treat ontological addiction. What is attachment? Attachment is actually the over-allocation of cognitive and emotional resources towards a particular object, which includes the self, a particular construct or an idea, to the extent that the object is assigned an attractive quality that is unrealistic and that exceeds its intrinsic worth. We have the tendency to create many selves. We have a self when we're at work. We have another self when we are with the family. We have a self when we're on our own. We have a self when we're in the discotheque. We have a self when we're with friends. So we create many selves, and we hold on to those selves. Throughout one working day, 24 hours, we change that self often. And to each of those selves that we have created, we attach ourselves. They become very important selves. Allow me to read from a paper that we wrote not too long ago. Ontological addiction theory asserts that by believing they exist both inherently and independently, individuals reify their sense of self to a point that they relate to themselves as the centerpiece in a world in which all other life forms, objects, and concepts are deemed to be peripheral. Each time an individual relates to the world and its phenomena as peripheral to themselves, belief in selfhood is reaffirmed, and this elicits rewards in the form of a more secure sense of self. Thus, an addiction feedback loop develops. In general, ontological addiction theory follows the development of a sense of selfhood during childhood. The symptoms are typically intensified during adolescence and then into adulthood. So in a sense, when we are first born, we have no concepts, we have no thoughts, there's no sense of self. But gradually through conditioning of our parents, then our teachers, our peer groups, and our own condition, we tend to condition ourselves, we become more and more attached to this idea of having a self, or the creation, we create different selves, and we become attached to them. The functional consequences are that the mind turns in on itself, and effectively we become somewhat exhausted with ourselves and with the many selves that we've created. So much so that perhaps I would argue that today, with the advent of social media and the virtual world, people do have the tendency, or not everyone, but within the gaming world, for example, there is the tendency for people to create a virtual self, which doesn't look anything like themselves and doesn't behave anything like themselves, but they become quite addicted to that self. They identify with that virtual self that they have created. Ontological addiction can occur with other symptoms and diagnoses. It's comorbid, in other words, with such things as anxiety, depression, personality disorders, trauma, and stress-related disorders, obsessive compulsion disorder. However, there is no diagnostical significance when it comes to neurodevelopmental disorders and biologically related disorders, brain trauma, for example. So allow me to unpack a little bit the definition of ontological addiction theory. We used the term deep-rooted belief. This emphasizes the persistent and consuming nature of the belief in an inherently existing self. It's rather similar to core beliefs in cognitive behavioral therapy, but it's a much more ingrained form of belief. Within the Buddhist teachings, we learn that thinking, behavior, and belief patterns leave an imprint on the mind stream, including after death. Therefore, perhaps there is a latent tendency to clutch to a self when we are born. This concept of not non-self is very, very important. It's very interrelated to the concept of emptiness, which my colleague will talk about this afternoon. But for many people, especially in the West, the idea of letting go of self is very difficult. The idea of emptiness is a very difficult concept. It's a very scary place to be. I'll talk about that later on. We use the term inherently existing self, or I. This is very different from the Western psychological model of self, whereby people such as Jung, Rogers, and so on, identify very much with the self. The self, or the creation of the self, the supporting of the self, becomes a protective factor. Okay? However, this phenomena, all phenomena, including humans, don't manifest as discrete standalone entities, but rely on innumerable causes and conditions. I exist only because you all exist. You exist, all of you, only because I exist. We are interrelated. We are interconnected. If one of us were not here in this moment, then this moment would simply not exist. The fact that phenomena are fundamentally interconnected, that is to say, absolutely limitless, boundless, means that they are of the nature of non-self. The notion of an inherently and independently existing self, or I, is erroneous. If I might diverge a little bit to give an example, can I use one of these pieces of paper? Okay. My name is actually Edo, but let's say I'm paper, yes? So, I want to discover myself. I have to investigate to find myself, yes? So, when I look into myself, what's the first thing I find? What am I made of? Paper. I'm made of? Sorry? Wood?
Cow.
Wood.
Cow. C-L-O-U. Cow.
Wood is made of a tree, so I find a tree. A tree needs a seed, so I find the seed. In order to grow into that tree, which made that wood, which created this paper, I need the sun, the moon, stars. I need water, earth, salt, minerals. I find all things, yet I still can't find me. I, me, and mine. Yes? I don't find paper. If I put myself under an electron microscope, what do I find? I find atoms, photons, electrons, quarks, 3 quarks that run around the electrons. Without any one of those elements, this paper does not exist. I, Edo, simply do not exist, inherently, independently, autonomously. We used the terms unwillingness to relinquish and impaired functionality. Now, these terms are effectively the addiction component of ontological addiction. I only have a very short time, really, to try to introduce a rather complex theory. Ontological addiction satisfies the criteria for addiction according to the components model of addiction of Professor Mark Griffiths. For example, salience. The belief in a discrete I entity dominates the thoughts. It dominates feelings and dominates behaviors. If we just take a little bit of time to observe ourselves, and perhaps it's easier actually to observe others, we'll see how important the I is to people. The individual cannot associate with the belief as being separate from themselves. They are the I that they have created. We are the I that we create. Mood modification. That is the second part of the component model. Belief in an intrinsically existing self results in craving for objects, situations, and experiences that are understood to advance the interest of the self. Acquiring these elicits temporary, I repeat that, temporary feelings of happiness. The third, tolerance. So increasing levels of immersion in self-centered emotions, discursive thinking patterns, and worldly affairs are required to sustain and augment the erroneous belief in inherent existence. That is to say, the soap opera of self. We find a situation that makes us a little bit happy, and then we want to recreate it. So we do our best to have more. We want to be more happy. So we immerse ourselves in that situation which at one time made us happy. And we make ourselves believe that it's continuing to make us happy. And we need more of that situation to make us happier. The fourth, withdrawal symptoms. Any suggestion of transcending selfhood is regarded as a threat, and it is repelled. Selfhood results in craving for objects, situations, and experiences that are understood to advance the interests of self. Not acquiring these, if we don't manage to do it, this elicits intrapersonal, intrapsychic, and interpersonal conflict. That is to say, suffering. And of course, the last, which is relapse. Ego-driven cognitive behavioral processes quickly re-establish themselves following efforts to undermine addiction to selfhood. So, when the person tries to relinquish an attachment to self, they suffer from withdrawal symptoms. We're currently evaluating, in the process of evaluating and validating a test for ontological addiction. And this is the test in raw form. This is one of the forms of the test. Just take a look at it and perhaps even jot something down. You can even try, perhaps at home, to do the test to see how addicted to yourselves you are. Okay? So, Can you still all hear me okay if I just move away from the mic? Yeah? So, how often during the last 6 months have you thought of how you could increase your wealth, your status, or your material possessions? We tend to think about this quite a lot, actually. In the last 6 months, how often have you felt that you were right and everyone else was completely wrong? How often have you been offended? How easy it is for us to take offense. Yes? How often have you felt superior or inferior compared to someone else? This is rather important because generally we think of the person who feels superior or acts in a superior manner as rather ego-driven, and the person who feels a little bit inferior, who doesn't speak up, we think that perhaps they're a little bit timid and humble, perhaps. But having the sense of, I'm not like that person, I can't do that, I, that's always ego. That's always self. How often have you been told by others to let go of a situation without listening to them? You know, something happens during our everyday life. Someone says something in an angry way. Perhaps they're feeling bad that day, but we hold on to it and we're going to get them back. How often does that happen? How often have you thought about how other people see you or what they think about you? We do this all of the time. Just look at the fashion publicity on television. At spring, we have a new fashion. Summer, we have a new fashion. Autumn, we have a new fashion. Winter, we have a new fashion. And we have to change the wardrobe. Otherwise, people will think we're out of date. How often have we felt regret after doing something kind? This does happen. How often have we put our own interests before those of others? The survival kicks in, the instinct of survival kicks in, so we look after ourselves instead of looking after others first. How often have we felt the need to occupy ourselves more to avoid periods of quiet or of being on our own? This is somewhat paradoxical. The person who suffers from ontological addiction, that is to say, who is attached to themselves, actually have difficulty in staying with themselves, just with themselves. Why would that be, do you think? Well, being with others, it's the other people who actually reward us. Oh, that's good. That's a nice dress. That's a great statement. So we need others in order to support our own reification of our own self. Being only with ourselves, for many people, is rather difficult. How often have we felt need to occupy ourselves more to avoid periods of being on our own? How often do we become tired, stressed, or unwell because of keeping up with the Jones, keeping up appearances, buying a new car? Next door neighbor has bought a new Mercedes. I have to get a better one. Okay, so this happens quite often. You can try scoring yourselves and see where you lie. If you wish. How am I doing? Fine. Okay, how do we treat ontological addiction? It works in 3 phases, perhaps. The first phase is actually to get the person to become aware of the imputed self, or I would prefer to say the imputed selves. As I said before, we have many selves, we create many selves. And if we have the power, which we do, to create a self, and to make that self function to a degree, then we have the power to deconstruct that self and perhaps reconstruct something rather beautiful. So the first phase is becoming aware that we have actually created, we are the creators of that self. Before ego deconstruction can begin, we really have to be aware of that fact, the many selves that we have created. The fact that we have created that construction and the various attributes of that imputed self or of those imputed selves. Phase 1 thus focuses on enhancing self-awareness and the implausibility of selfhood. This requires a degree of psychoeducation that focuses on logic and the principles of non-self and of emptiness. Both these concepts are interrelated and profoundly interconnected. Cultivating proficiency in meditative awareness. This is mostly concentrative meditation. The Pali term is samatha, as opposed to vipassana, insight-based meditation. Mindfulness here is very important in order to regulate concentration and ensure that that part of the mind that is focused, concentrated, remains meditative in aspect. Concentrative meditation helps to introduce tranquility into the body and gives breathing space into the mind. A calm mind, calm body, calm body, calm mind. Many people have this strange idea that one has to sit with one's legs folded to practice meditation. That is a load of garbage. One has to be comfortable. Sitting with the legs folded, that is a very, very solid position. Solid body, solid mind, and that is excellent. But if the people can't manage that, they can sit in a chair and be comfortable. If the body is comfortable, the mind is comfortable and can more readily enter into concentrated meditation. Feelings of meditative tranquility should be encouraged, but dependency on those same feelings should be discouraged. You can actually become addicted to certain states produced during meditation. The second phase, once having become aware of the fact that the self is there, it exists, or that is what we have created. The second phase, we have to deconstruct. As I said, if we have the power to construct, we have the power to deconstruct that imputed self. Cultivating spiritual competencies, including compassion, generosity, patience, loving kindness, and perhaps most importantly, an awareness of the fact that this is a very precious life and it is very short. We don't know when it's going to end, and we don't know how it is going to end, but end it will. These techniques help to undermine, indirectly, egocentricity. Meditative investigation, once we are concentrated, focused and tranquil, then we can begin to analyze things. So we can begin to introduce meditative investigation of selfhood and phenomena using vipassana or insight meditation. Please note, vipassana is vipassana. It is not mindfulness. Mindfulness is mindfulness. Samatha is samatha. Vipassana is vipassana. Let's not get them all mixed up. This involves capturing the attentional focus that we have cultivated during concentrative meditation, then directing it to identify the causes, properties, and absolute nature of a given phenomenon, including self. It involves attempting to locate the selfness of the object of meditation and the selfness of the meditator more generally. In the third phase, once we have managed to become aware of the fact that we've created this self, then we've managed to gently and tranquilly deconstruct it, clear the space. We can then begin to reconstruct something rather dynamic and fluid, because there is not one thing in all of the universes that remains still and static. All things are in a state of flux. Therefore, why do we try to cling on to a self and keep it the same way, rather than allowing it to be dynamic and fluid and to change? So the object is not to eliminate an identification with self. Non-self does not mean not caring for self. Non-self is a tool that is used to undermine the attachment to self. It is a construct of subject-object, that is to say, self and other conceptualization. It describes an experience or state of realization, but it can never fully embody that state or that experience. When concepts of self and non-self are then abandoned, because even having the idea of non-self, having that conceptualization, it's a category. It's something that we hold on to. We have to let go of that as well. So once they are abandoned, an individual abides as true self. True self encompasses the individual and the whole. The individual is interconnected with the whole. The whole is interconnected with the individual. There's no separation between object and subject. True self cares for the individual because they care for the whole, and, of course, vice versa. This newly constructed self is a more fluid and dynamic entity. It accepts change, it allows change, and most importantly, it participates, creates change. By reducing egocentric beliefs and behaviors, there no longer exists a substantial self that can be, for example, offended, that can be let down, cheated, or traumatized. In other words, there is no longer a fixed locus upon which maladaptive, cognitive, affective states can assemble. and the newly constructed and dynamic self thus liberates itself from the various functional impairments associated with ontological addiction. There are many, many definitions of mindfulness, one of which is paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. This is a definition by Jon Kabat-Zinn. But within this, having interviewed John, he stated that mindfulness is not a spiritual practice. I'm so sorry, I can't agree with that, actually. Mindfulness, for me, my personal opinion, is a spiritual practice. We are mind, body, and that's something else. Call it what you will. Third element, I like to call it spiritual. Within the second generation of mindfulness-based interventions, we have defined this as the full, direct, and active awareness of experienced phenomena that is psychospiritual in aspect and maintained from one moment to the next. Both definitions are equally valid. One complements the other. But what is this second generation? Well, second generation mindfulness-based interventions, they tend to be overtly psychospiritual in nature. Within these interventions, a range of meditative techniques are taught. Ethics is often explicitly taught. And very, very importantly, instructors, or the training of instructors, typically requires several years of supervised practice. However, although the interventions have roots within Buddhism, in fact, mindfulness is born there, really, they are taught in a secular manner in general. There's a burgeoning of interest in the use of mindfulness within clinical practice. In fact, this graph, the blue lines are first generation mindfulness. The orange lines, you can see, the orange bars, are second generation mindfulness. And we can see the tendency for growth. Mind you, in the interests of transparency, many of these papers, perhaps 60 or more of these papers, we actually publish. So perhaps we're pushing the tendency towards second generation mindfulness. Just a brief look at some of the various interventions, first generation mindfulness-based interventions. We have, for example, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, mindfulness-based stress reduction, and mindfulness-based relapse prevention. Second generation mindfulness-based interventions, meditation awareness training, which, as I said, we developed some years ago, compassion cultivation training, and mindfulness-based positive behavior support. But they all tend to follow the same format of program. We'll just look at mindfulness, meditation awareness training briefly. The structure of the program is mindfulness, meditation, weekly full group sessions, guided meditation and mindfulness exercises, seminars, discussions, and group work. We have contemplative principles, self-practice at home, which is very, very important to encourage the people to practice. You can't just do this once a week. So practice at home is very important. And most importantly, within meditation awareness training, we have a one-to-one support session, which within an 8-week duration happens twice in general. This is very important because the meditative journey is an inward-looking journey. It's introspective. And people find many obstacles. They find many things. Some they like, some they don't like. So talking to someone who has a little bit more experience often helps. This is the model of meditation awareness training, which I will not go into really. I don't have time. But as we can see, mindfulness itself is actually a rather small part. Mindfulness is not meditation. Meditation is not mindfulness. Mindfulness is like a guardian who looks over that part of the mind which is focused and concentrated. And that guardian assures that that mind that is focused will not be disturbed. It will remain meditative and focused. The important factor is insight, meditative insight. Of course, placing mindfulness back into its original context means that many things have to be taught contemporarily, and many things have to be practiced contemporarily. For instance, in ethical awareness, we have to teach people to practice generosity. Generosity with themselves, as well as generosity to others. And this does not necessarily mean giving of material things. Even when we are standing, listening, or sitting, listening to a person who is talking to us, if we are not actually listening, if we're thinking about what we are going to say, then we're not being awfully generous, and we're not being awfully patient. In fact, we're not actually giving that person anything. However, if we are fully there with that person, really, truly listening to what they say, and most importantly, to what they are not saying, then we are there. We are being generous. We are being patient. We are being compassionate. And of course, the aspects of wisdom have to be taught and they have to be practiced. So we come to complex and sometimes a little bit difficult concepts, such as emptiness, right view and intention, the concept of impermanence, as I mentioned earlier, death awareness, the awareness of the fact that this life is very, very precious. It's not going to happen again. So in every breath we take, and everything that we see, hear, smell, taste, and touch, in every breath we take, if we're not aware of it, then we might as well not be here. So this life is extraordinarily precious. So being aware of every moment, every phenomenon that passes our way in every single breath is really of vital importance. Because of interconnection, the fact that we are all interconnected, what I think, what I say, and what I do will have an influence on all other phenomena in the universe. What everything you think, you say, and you do will be the same. In fact, this moment in time, my thoughts, my actions, my words, they are creating my next moment and your next moment. Everything that you're thinking, saying, and doing is creating your next moment and that of everyone else. So we have a huge responsibility, really. But it's rather lovely. Okay, I will stop there, actually, and I'll open the forum to any questions. I don't promise answers. No questions? Smashing. Okay.
Thank you for your teaching. Then I have a question about how this meditation awareness training can put into the actually the patient. For example, the cancer patient, they are drawing on the suffering. Then how can we teach them to use this method, meditation awareness training, and help them to recovery? Thank you.
Okay. Who was talking, please?
Sorry.
Okay, got you.
And my name is Kathy, and a student of the University of West of England, and study on the Buddhist coping of the breast cancer survivor. So
Okay.
that is my question. Thank you.
Right. Okay. So, when a person is told that they have cancer, it's that point in time, that exact moment in time, is very, very critical. So how the medic refers to the patient, the words and tones of the words that are used are very, very important. For instance, with a person who is suffering from certain forms of, for instance, squamish carcinoma, okay? Very serious cancer. The doctor says, so sorry, you have this cancer, nothing to do about it. Go home, put your things together, put your affairs together, and in 3 months, you might as well say goodbye. Okay? Or I can say, take a seat, have a cup of tea. Now, we have this little problem. You're not the only one who has this problem. Let's see what we can do about it. Okay? Let's not make it into a big thing. There are many different ways that you can approach this. So, one of those ways is by preparing yourself. Okay? And I can point out different groups of people who have the same problem or have similar problems, who work together, and they learn about how things are going to evolve. So it's educating the person. Then we teach the person that although, particularly with squamish carcinoma, there's a tremendous amount of pain. Now, the person who is suffering from a lot of pain sees everything through the glasses of pain. So they see, hear, smell, taste, touch through the cancer, through the pain, and they become very locked onto themselves. Oh dear, I have cancer. It's all finished. I'm finished. There's no point anymore. Instead, the health services, the health professionals must encourage the person to live. We're all going to die. We don't know when. We don't know how. But that's going to happen. That's a certainty. In some ways, the person is a little bit fortunate because they have a timeline. Not everyone has that timeline. But with squamish carcinoma, usually it's 5 years. There's a timeline. But it doesn't mean 5 years does not mean 5 years. Okay? I know patients who have been told by their doctors, you have 3 months to live. And that was 18 years ago. So, learning that they create that self that's made up of cancer, made up of pain, they make it into something that's really very, very solid. And that becomes the most important thing to them. Instead, what they have to learn is to objectify it, put it to one side, not subjectify it. So they're not their thoughts, as was said before. The thoughts are not them. The emotions are not them. Yes? So they can learn to objectify, put it to one side, and observe it, participate in it, and actually work with it. Get the mind to work with that problem. Does that make any sense? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Shonin, for your very inspiring presentation. The next guest speaker is Professor Samuel Wong. Professor Wong is the professor and head of Division of Family Medicine and Primary Health Care of the Chinese University of Hong Kong. He is trained both as a family doctor as well as a public health doctor and has joined the Chinese University for 15 years already. His research interests include evaluating and developing mental health interventions for common health problems in primary care, with a special interest in evaluating mindfulness-based interventions for common health problems. He is currently the director of the recently established CUHK Thomas Jin Center for Mindfulness Research and Training. The topic of his presentation today is mindfulness-based interventions for psychological suffering. So please join me to give a big hand to welcome Professor Wong to begin.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I want to thank Venerable Hong Si for inviting me to be here. I need to declare that I'm a heavily addicted identity. I'm very addicted, and that's why I'm here, and that's why I'm learning mindfulness to help myself and also to help the others people who work with me, who interact with me every day. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the research that we have been conducted over the past 15 years. And these are first-generation mindfulness interventions. This is the first time I learned about the distinction between the first generation and second generation. So I hope that you have a perspective of where the work is. And these are mostly clinical work, meaning that these are the patients that we see in the clinic, and these are the common health problems that we see. So you see that this is what is in the mindfulness world now, that when you go to Google, you can see all these very different forms of mindfulness meditation. And also in the Time magazine, this is the second time they talk about a mindful revolution. So in order to put this in a perspective that is easier to understand, I plan to do it in a very different way. It's in a live course approach. So saying that I'm going to talk a little bit about the clinical evidence starting before you're born. So when someone is pregnant, that they join the mindfulness program, how does that change the postnatal situation to when someone is dying in palliative care. So, but since there's only 40 minutes, so I will put it brief. So I will be presenting some of the summary and some of the work that we've been conducted in the past 15 years. And I know the previous two talks are very intellectual, very interesting. So if you, and mine is a little bit more superficial, I would say, because I'm just telling you what is going on. So you don't get the intellectual stimulation as much. But I hope you will forgive me, but because I still want you to give a bigger picture of what is going on in the world of the first generation mindfulness intervention. So we have mindful childbirth. So that's before someone giving birth to a baby. There's a mindfulness childbirth program that is given to both the expecting mother and also the partners. There's a mindful parenting. So people who are stressed, and you know how important it is for parents, the influence on the children. Sometimes it's not the children problems, it's the parents. My Mind, which is a program for people with attention deficit hyperactivity disorders, and you know that there's an increasing prevalence I think simply because of our self-addiction. We're addicting and all this selfie and all that, making people very impatient, making people have attention deficit. Then you know the two generation program, the MBSR and the MBCT, the first generation, who covers most of the adult psychological issues, including chronic pain, anxiety, and depression. So the first, I'll talk about some of the systematic review on mindfulness intervention in the perinatal period. There's a systematic review. So what are systematic reviews? Are reviews that collect most, if not all, of the clinical trials that have been conducted up to the date of the systematic review, and they look into it and try to extract the information. And the advantage of that is that a lot of the time when we do research, because of limited resources and time, we cannot do a very big study. So our sample size are very limited. And when our sample size are limited, often you cannot see whether there's actual change. So the systematic review helps you to put them all together to see if there's more clinical evidence that can help you regarding whether something works or not. So this is a systematic review done on perinatal period. And they collected papers, all published in English. Unfortunately, most of the systematic review are published in English. And this can be qualitative and quantitative studies. So they explore the effectiveness of mindfulness-based intervention during the perinatal period. And a lot of these interventions are MBCT or MBSR. Okay, and they are mostly quantitative studies because you need them to collect all the data to summarize. And they mostly look into depression, anxiety, and stress. So we found that there are 17 studies, overall 595 people in the quantitative studies, but only 9 studies were control studies. So what does that mean? Meaning that if you don't compare with a control group, a lot of the time you don't know whether the improvement is due to the fact that something simply improved. Like if you have subfactual depression, about 60% or 30% of the people will get better within 3 months. So you don't know whether something is working or not with our control group, and whether the control group is actually something active, meaning that that contains something that might be of significance to improve. So for example, if I put a number of patients in a group with social interaction, with someone caring for them, listening for them, that might improve. So when we look into scientific evidence, and especially evidence when they incorporate it into clinical guidelines for people with depression, anxiety, and other emotional problems, we look into whether that interventions are better or have the same efficacy or something that is evidence-based that we are currently using. So in terms of the perinatal literature, the types of interventions, there's quite a breadth. And most of them only look into pre and post results. And they found that actually evidence so far is still not very strong at the moment. So we need more studies to do that. And the part of the reason is that a lot of these studies did not compare to active control group, meaning that sometimes you have improvement, but you're not sure whether it is due to the intervention itself. And the type of intervention sometimes does matter. So there's one recent study by Professor Duncan in UCSF, and now in Madison, Wisconsin, working with Richard Davidson, showing that there might be some improvement in 2017. So we did the studies, and actually it's just completed, and we are writing the manuscript about a few years ago, and we trained midwives in Hong Kong. So these are the midwives. A lot of them are from Prince of Wales Hospital. And we train them for 9 weeks, which is a very structured program called Mindful Childbirth. And they publish a book. And it's 3 hours for both pregnant women and their partners. So I think one of the effects could be that you just bring the partners here to spend time with them for 3 months, 3 hours. That can itself be effective. And we also have a silent day session with reunions around 2 months after birth. And they all have to practice daily for 30 minutes per day, 6 days a week. So this is the setting that we have, so everyone come together. So these are some of the components of the mindful childbirth. So they have mindful praying practices. So basically, they actually are put on, the husbands or the partners need to put on ice. Okay, so that's to simulate what it's like to have birth, you know. Interesting, isn't it? And they also have to be speaking and listening practice, listening to the partners, active listening, meaning that no talking when you listen, no judgment. Okay, and so that they can help with the development of partner communications. And since, because of the fact that we have pretty much a community, so we have, using a randomized control trial designs, comparing that to an active control, which is the antenatal childbirth education and support. So these are also support group that with their partners together. So we're trying to control being together, trying to control the group interaction, trying to control the instructor time, and trying to control the contact time. And the course duration, assignment, they're all the same. So they also have exercise to do. Instead of the meditation, they do something else. And also we provide them with snacks, community building, etc. So our inclusion criteria, including pregnancies at second trimester, and these are people in Hong Kong, they speak Cantonese. No previous meditation experience, we want to see novice. No daily practice with yoga before. And they don't have concurrent diagnosis of depression. So we're looking at, in fact, this study is a bit different from the others, that we're not looking at problems. Of course, pregnancy is not a problem. It's a natural process, right? So we're looking at well-being. We see whether they can improve the mental well-being of postnatal well-being, basically. Because as you know, in Hong Kong, we have a significant prevalence of people with postnatal depression. Okay, and a lot of this time, they actually have some symptoms before they were given birth. And that has to do with some of the support that they have. So these are relatively healthy people. And because they volunteer for all these sessions, they're relatively mentally quite well. So when we compare to the mental well-being, compared to the general population, these are very similar. Okay, so these are the population that we're talking about. And our primary outcome measures are mental component summary, but we also measure other secondary outcomes. So these are secondary. So these are not the main thing we look at, including the depression score, including the stress, including the anxiety, including the pain, and also the postpartum bonding questionnaires. And we also measure the mindfulness scale. But as you know, there's not very good mindfulness scales currently, because it's something very hard to measure, basically. And because people define it differently, it makes it very complicated. So I'm actually thinking about maybe one day we can have all these brain things that we can use to measure changes, but it's very expensive, so we cannot do it. So this is the console diagram. So we randomize, we actually recruited one of the largest study sample in the literature so far. It's 183 people. So it's quite a lot of people, quite a lot of work. And we get funding from the Health and Medical Research Fund to do this work from the government. One of the things we found that is that in the mindfulness group, we have a larger loss to follow up. And we're not sure why. I think because some of the fact is we might be more demanding because they, that the exercise they have to practice every day for half an hour, which is not easy for someone living in Hong Kong. So we measured several points. So before someone giving birth, T2 after intervention, and they all get the intervention before they give birth to a child, reunion in 6 months. So this is the results. So we found that there is improvement in mental well-being in both groups. But in the mindfulness group, there's more improvement, and it's significant at the T4, which is about 6 months after the intervention. We didn't find any difference in the epidemiological depressive scales, but we find that there's difference in depressive symptoms using the CSD scale, which might be, I think it's a sensitive, because one scale is more sensitive than the other to measure changes, so that could be one of the reasons. We didn't find any difference in the perceived scales, but for anxiety, state anxiety, we find there's a difference. We find that people in the mindfulness group, there's a more increase in terms of dropping of the anxiety symptoms when it's compared to the antenatal program. But we didn't find any difference in the partners. We didn't find any difference in the fathers, unfortunately. And when we did some qualitative research, we found that they didn't actually do any of the meditation. They felt like they were forced to come for 3 hours, and they didn't do anything. So it's so unfair, isn't it? That women have to do all this work, and the partner is just there, and joy and being happy. So better results in quality of life 6 months after childbirth with lower depression and anxiety. Also, we didn't find any difference in parent-infant bonding. Actually, I'm very much interested in following the children to see if there's a difference in the attachment they have. And you know the attachment actually 3歲定80, right? So when you're 3 years old, it determines when you're 60. So in the life course literature, there's quite a lot of work in how prenatal programming sometimes can affect later life development of chronic diseases. So if we have a larger sample size, but this is a bit too small. So I hope that, because I know people in the Netherlands have done something similar, so one day we can put them together and make a data set. So we find that there's better mental well-being, no long-term effects on stress, but the overall mindfulness level increased in both groups though. It just shows some of the scale is not very proper because it's increased in both groups, but there's more increase in the mindfulness group. We didn't see any beneficial effects in the significant others. Although we actually find very interesting is that the people have a high level of stress at baseline. They have more improvement. And if you know the literature by Mark Williams in the MBCD literature, people who have adverse childhood experience, they are more likely to benefit from mindfulness intervention in general. But unfortunately, we didn't ask about the adverse childhood experience among the mothers because we have a very healthy population. But I think those people who need more help at baseline, they might benefit more in this intervention. So Mindful Childbirth, let's go to My Mind, which is a program that we brought to Hong Kong a few years ago, bringing a professor from the Netherlands, University of Amsterdam, which they just held the mindfulness conference in July. And this is I think Susan has come to Hong Kong the third time, and I'm going to invite her to come. Well, actually, in the 2020 and also 2019, someone else is going to invite her. So she's almost like a regular person in Hong Kong. So I did a review on the current evidence on mindfulness-based intervention for people with ADHD, which is a meta-analysis. And so far I found actually that's not a lot published. There's 10 studies published up to 2014, 4 with waitlist control and 6 with pre and post design. When you look at these studies, you find that there's a high heterogeneity. What does that mean? It means that sometimes it's very hard to put them together because these studies are so different. So basically, if something more than 60% is too much, 80% almost meaningless to put them together. So it means that these studies, sometimes they use different intervention, they have different follow-up, they use different scales. And it's very hard to put them together. And you look at this analysis, they found that the effect size was larger for adults with ADHD than with children, meaning that there might not be enough studies for children. For hyperactivity and impulsivity, this is better for children with ADHD compared to inattention. But still, you can see that there's still quite a moderate range of heterogeneity. Okay, and so it's promised to do more studies in this area because there may be potential benefits, but the results may not be interpreted differently. And you know that there's increased prevalence of ADHD in over the world. And I think some of them is overdiagnosis, and some of them you just feel that kids are too active. You just don't want to see them so active. You just put them, be quiet, and give them medications. That's how the adult were trying to control the children, right? So let's see if something else can be done. So Susan has been coming to Hong Kong. We did a pilot about 2 years ago. We adapted the MBCT and MBSR program from Susan. She came to Hong Kong a few years ago and trained about 35 people, health professionals. And all these 35 professionals go on to conduct training for children's and their parents. So one of the things about this intervention is that they are not only training the children, but the parents have to be there, which is very important. And so we did a pilot with Huang Society a few years ago. So we have 8 weekly 90-minute group interventions. So it's interesting. We have one parent group, which is about 15 people. But for the children with ADHD, we have about 2 to 3 groups at each time. So we have 5 to 6 children, and with each group, we need 2 helpers and 1 instructor. Because if you look at the group, it's interesting. They're pulling down the carpet, they're doing all these stuff, but you have to see them as a genuine accepting attitude, which is not easy. Very, very challenging. So so we have 3 psychologists, 1 social worker, 1 public health academic, to looking for how to do this. And for the pilot, we recruited 11 people, 11 children, 8 to 12 years, and one of their parents have to come, which is a Friday night. I still remember I was joining this, which is not easy. Some of the parents, actually, when we asked them, some of the parents would say, well, can we just do it for the children? I don't want to come. I don't want to join. I just want them to be better and doing academically better. Can we do that? But no. Why? Because if you train the children, they go home, they have the parents, they're doing the same thing, it's not going to help them. Because it's interpersonal. So you need to change both stakeholders. You need to change the parents as well. And in fact, training the parents, I think, is more important. It's more important. So we're looking at feasibility and acceptability, and the objective measures. So we use computer to do all these attention tests, which is very tedious. It takes about an hour, sometimes 2 hours. So it's difficult to get the children to do the test because they find it so boring. So this is 8 sessions from Mars. So it's actually modified from the MBCT. I think Susan, when she started devising this program, she talked to Mark Williams from Oxford to look at how to do that. And there's 8 sessions. Interesting is that 3 of the sessions I do it with the parents together. So they actually have some interpersonal interaction. And so these are the children, and they're very active, very playful, and very interesting. So we have an attendance rate of 91%. Which is, I think, in all the studies I've conducted, one of the highest one. Because I think part of that's because there's a very big need for that. They're quite satisfied. So because we have a number of outcomes, in this pilot, we didn't find any significant change in the outcomes, except for the objective attention test and some of the CPT3 omissions. But we find that it's feasible to do, and it's acceptable for the parents. So that's important. So this is some of the qualitative results. So previously, I got angry easily with him, but now when I see him behave this way, I will stop. So you pause, you think, you reflect, and I think more from his angle and more accepting of him. So I think that's some of the dynamic change of someone going through that. And the children said that their mom and dad quarrel less. I could not fall asleep before. If I was scolded by teachers in school and now it's okay, I would do breathing before sleep. So they're doing the 3-minute breathing space. And there's many yoga poses as well. So they can be a cat, a cow, all these different things to attract them. So after we find it's potential, feasible, and we think about it could be beneficial, so now we just got funded last year from the Research Grant Council to do a bigger studies. And this time we're comparing it to a CBT, which is quite challenging. As you know, CBT can be quite effective, especially for the parents. So we now recruit about 150 people. Families, I would say. And we also got funding from the Dick Chan Foundation to use my mind for other psychological problems, including people with autistic problems, and also in people with psychological issues, so internalizing problems. And our aim is to actually recruit 450 families, which is going to be a lot of work. So I'm getting worried a bit, and my addiction is also into how to get this done and how to make sure the donors don't kill me. So I have all these addiction that I realized when I was listening, and it's not easy to deal with. So mindful childbirth, mindful parenting, and then let's go for the MBSR and MBCT. So I think most of you know what MBCT is. Am I right? Anyone not sure? Not know? Okay, so mindfulness-based stress reduction program is initially started in the 70s in the Massachusetts universities. And John Kabat-Zinn, in fact, is a scientist who's trained in MIT. He's not a doctor, and he was working in the Massachusetts Medical School, and he got referred, and he saw all these patients with psychosomatic problems or chronic pain that no doctors want to see them because every time they have complaints and they give them medications, etc., it doesn't work. So he suggested, after learning some meditations, I think from a Korean Buddhist teachers, and he thought, well, maybe I can do it in the basement of a hospital and get all these internists to refer patients to me and see if they get better. So he started doing this at the basement, 8-week program, If you want to look at the videos that he have done, he looked like Tom Cruise back then. And I understand why it's so effective. You know, if you have Tom Cruise wiping your tears, you get better. I'm sure you do. So initially, that's how it was done, and then and people start to get attention to it because he started publishing in it. He's a scientist, and then it started to different parts of the world. And in the early 2000, Toronto, Oxford, and Cambridge, 3 psychologists, they were trying to think about what kind of method we can use to reduce the relapse of recurrent depression. As you know, if people have 3 previous episodes of depression, their chance of recurrence is 100%. So as a medical doctor, if I see someone like that, I will give them antidepressants for life, which means a lot of suffering for the patients. Some of them is side effects, some of them is the diagnosis, some of them is the helplessness that they feel, that you need to rely on medications. And some of them do actually need that. So they were thinking about what method they can, and they learned about this mindfulness approach from John Kabat-Zinn in Massachusetts, and they flew over there into Massachusetts from Cambridge, Oxford, and Toronto, and then they wrote a book called the MBCT, Mindfulness-based Cognitive Therapy. And Mark Williams also wrote a very good book called, it's not here, but it's called the Something About Frantic World, which I remember because we do live in a frantic world. So they start to do research in these areas, and now this is one of the most evidence-based, mindfulness-based intervention in the literature, I think, for people with recurrent depression. So one of the things they discuss is having a metacognitive view, decentering. It's a bit like less attachment in a way, that you can see thoughts and not facts. So it's an 8-week program, and Willem Coogan, who is now the director of Mindfulness Center in Oxford, he published in The Lancet in 2015. He recruited patients from primary care. These are the people with recurrent depression, and he compared them with antidepressants, which is quite effective, right? You think it's quite effective? Yeah? Medications? Actually, medication is actually not that great. It's great, but not great. Because some people actually cannot take the medications because of side effects, other factors. But it's one of the evidence-based treatment that we use in medical care. And he compared this in a very large study, more than 460 people. And he found that MBCT is the same as antidepressants in reducing depression relapse among people with 3 previous episodes of depression, which is a big news for the medical community. So this is the graph that they shows there's no difference between the two. So one is the antidepressant, the other, and there's no significant difference between the two, up to 60 weeks. So actually, this is up to 24 months, okay, but the other study showed up to 60 weeks. So Professor Coogan from Oxford, so he thought, these are very good studies, but if we can pull them together, then we can provide stronger evidence. And he did. And he published this in JAMA Psychiatry just 2 years ago. So they collect all the studies using exactly the same method, and they did a meta-analysis. And this is not just a common meta-analysis, this is an individual patient data analysis, meaning you actually get the original data from each of the PI. Meaning that they are very giving, that they give you the data, and they work together. So working together, you get farther, right? As what the VC said. So this is how it works. So they use all the randomized trials, they use MBCT as the intervention, and they compare with at least one non-MBCT treatment, and they have 1,258 subjects, which you cannot do if you work on your own. You may do it faster, but you cannot make more progress. And they found that MBCT has a reduced risk of depressive relapse within a 60-week period, meaning that 60 weeks is how long? Which is quite a significant, up to 1 year. And the hazard ratio is about 0.69, meaning that there's a 31% reduction. 31% reduction on relapse. And it's similar to evidence-based intervention, similar to other medications. So this is one of the strongest evidence in the literature for mindfulness-based first-generation intervention. And because of that, so these are the evidence, and because of that, the NICE guideline actually incorporated that, saying that if you're GPs and you're patients with recurrent depression, one of the options is actually to refer you to have an MBCT program, and it's free of charge in the UK. Isn't that nice? Shouldn't we have that? I hope one day we do. Because if we don't implement, all we're talking about means nothing, right? If people cannot use it. So now CBT and MBCT are one of the recommended treatment for people with recurrent depression in the UK. So if you look at other reviews, what about other problems like anxiety besides depression? What about drug addiction? Craving. Craving is one of the things that has to do with our psychological suffering and other things. So there's a very nice systematic review done in 2018, which is this year, which is freshly published in Clinical Psychology Review. I recommend you to read this if you have time. And they put all the studies together, which is a very large sample size, and we classify them into addiction, anxiety, depression, chronic pain, etc. And they look at what interventions are the most evidence-based if you're going to do mindfulness-based cognitive therapy or mindfulness-based stress reduction. And what you should look into is this. They compare that to evidence-based treatment, meaning that this is what we use in medical care. So for example, anxiety, we might use CBT. Depression, we might use CBT as well. Some of them might use medications. Yeah. Smoking, we might use some of the gums, the patch. Yeah. Hong Kong has one of the lowest smoking rates in Hong Kong. And I hope to do this in Hong Kong to make it even lower next year. So they found that for depression, you see the line here, meaning that there's no difference between the mindfulness meditation and the evidence-based treatment. So anxiety, no difference, although it seems it's not as good at depression, which there's simply no difference in evidence-based treatment. Interestingly, for smoking, it's better. It's better than what we have, which is interesting. This is actually, there's something that I just realized this year, that smoking is actually something that we can think about. Overall, there's no difference in terms of these evidence-based intervention when it's compared. There's some evidence for chronic pain, yeah, addiction, schizophrenia, but these are comparing to no treatment, okay? So you have one intervention and nothing. So when you have nothing, they usually don't get better or get worse, right? If you have something, you have non-specific treatment, you see the difference is less, because if you give them something, they might improve. So the difference is less. But if you get the same, and if you get the evidence-based treatment, and there's no difference between the evidence-based treatment, that means this is something that we can use instead. So the most commonly studied disorder was depression, which is not surprising. About 30% of all the studies conducted with randomized control trial is in depression. And for study with follow-up assessment, average follow-up is up to 6 months. So we don't have things like we follow them for 5 years. No, we yet do not have that, unless we have a cohort that we can follow for over 15 years. That would be very interesting. So based on the findings, it seems that a stronger recommendation can be made for mindfulness treatment for depression with good evidence, and also supporting the use maybe for pain conditions. There's some evidence. Smoking, more evidence, and some of the addictive disorders. So we did a studies using mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for generalized anxiety disorders published in the British Journal of Psychiatry in 2016. We recruited about 190 people in 3 groups. One group is mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. One group is psychoeducation using CBT principles. And the third group is usual care. As you know, the wait time for psychiatry assessment in the place I work with is about 2 years. If you're urgent, if you're suicidal, it's about a few weeks to 1 month or immediately. So unless you're dying, you wait for 2 years. So when I did this study a few years ago, we have something called the usual care period, where we simply just use usual medical, meaning that they just see the GPs and they're not giving much treatments regularly. But we want, because it's ethical reason, we only can do it for a few months. But now, you have to wait for a year and a half, at least, to see and we collect the data immediately post-intervention, 3 months, 6 months, and 9 months after the intervention. So this is the group. We recruited 182 people from the community. One is to MBCT, one is to psychoeducation using CBT principles, and one is allocated to usual care. So the usual care group, meaning that they don't have much. And you can tell the difference if you don't give them much and just usual medical care. And usual medical care in our setting, in the public general settings, is about 7 minutes. 7 minutes of consultation time. So you cannot listen. You can only give, but not giving love. You give medications. You just give them repeat prescription a lot of the time. So this is how it is like. And the psychoeducation is being done by clinical psychologists who have been trained in CBT therapy. And this is the results. You can see the usual care. No difference, almost. Doesn't improve. But both groups, in terms of the MBCT and the psychoeducation using CBT principles, with the same amount of homework, improve. Although we see, interestingly, depressive symptoms and some of the anxiety symptoms seems to have a little bit better in the CBT group, although there's no significant difference between the CBT and the mindfulness-based cognitive therapy group. And this is up to 9 months. So they finish the intervention at baseline, post-intervention, and then 6 months after, they still continuing seeing the effects. So recently, this year, we finished our studies on another common problem, which is menopause. Menopause, again, is not a problem. It's a natural process. But it does bring a lot of suffering and distress sometimes to women. And we did the studies a few years ago using mindfulness-based stress reduction to see whether it can help people who are undergoing menopause to reduce some of the somatic and psychological symptoms. So when you look at the literature, this is published in the Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology, looking at randomized controlled trials. And this is including CBT. You can see that for hot flush bother, here, there's some evidence, but it's not very strong. Okay, if you look at the mean and the medium, there's no difference, so not much evidence. But if you look at the mean, what does that mean? Meaning that some study works, some study didn't. Meaning that you still need more study to prove that. And on the medium term, if you put them together, it seems it works, but it's still that some study didn't work. Okay, same for the menopausal symptoms. It doesn't seem to work for everyone. So we use MBSR to see whether it can improve menopausal symptoms when it's compared to a psychoeducation group. So we recruited 197 people in the clinical settings, and we have one group with 98 people versus 99 people in psychoeducation group. So the psychoeducation group is run by nurse. So these are the nurses who give also 8 weeks, also 2.5 hours, and they also addressing people with menopause, including how they deal with the pain, including how they deal with the somatic symptoms, in also including that they know they are undergoing menopause. Because in clinical setting, a lot of people come to see us, and they have all these symptoms of irritability, unhappiness, hot flashes, and they don't know what is going on. They are very worried. So we compare the two, and we follow them 2 months, 5 months, and 8 months after randomization. And we use something called the GCS, the Climatic Clinical Scores, to look into all these different symptoms for people with menopausal symptoms. And our primary outcome measures is the total scores. And we find that there's decrease. It seems that after a while, the psychoeducation stopped to work. So they have this baseline, okay, and then after 2 months, it seems both work when they have someone besides them. And then 5 months, it seems to work, but then psychoeducation seems to tail off, while the mindfulness meditation seems to continue to improve. So I was wondering, maybe they learned some skills that they can help them to deal with everyday life stress, that they can learn, that they can internalize, that they can use. So we find that both groups improve, but at 8 months' time, MBSR have better improvement in terms of the overall menopausal symptoms. And when we look at the subsets, we find that this is especially important for people with anxiety and depressive symptoms. It seems the psychological is where mindfulness seems to work better, but we didn't find a difference in terms of the sexual symptoms, not the genital symptoms, and also not the hot flush, etc., the psychovasomotor symptoms. I'm almost done. So what about older adults? Now everyone talking about aging populations. We are talking about people suffering from loneliness. And so can mindfulness work for these people? We improve psychological health, it includes their cognitive functioning, reduce loneliness. So these are some of the theoretical basis from a more biopsychosocial approach, the more boring approach, I would say. So some saying that meditation may improve some of these. Telomerase activity. As you know, our DNA tends to get shorter and shorter. So my DNA may be very short because of chronic self-attachment and chronic addiction than yours. You're practicing Buddhist. So if you look at my DNA, it's maybe shorter because my enzyme may not be working as good as yours. Okay? But if you do exercise, if you do meditation, it might be better because your enzyme may be working as a better efficiency. So you might have a longer telomerase. And in fact, UCLA, a few years ago, quite a while ago, they actually recruited lonely adults. And they look into the DNA of these adults. How do they look at that? They look at the DNA expression, looking at the white cell to see whether they have a change in the inflammation. Let's say if you have an infection, your white cell is activated, and there's an inflammation in your body, you get fever, etc. Okay? And that sometimes can predict your long-term mortality. So people who are lonely, you know what is special about them? They die earlier. So don't get lonely, okay? Come to join the Buddhist Counselling. You never ever get lonely. Okay, so they tested this 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction with a weightless control, but it's only a small sample, and they look at the DNA. I think it's small because it's expensive to look at the DNA. And they find that MBSR reduced the loneliness. Not only that, they down-regulated the inflammation-related gene expression at post-treatment. So it's quite interesting. And actually, there's a study done in China, published in the Proceeding of National Academy of Science. They find that meditation sometimes can actually reduce the inflammation in your DNA, which I think we need more studies, but it is a good start, I think. And there's now going on some studies using MBSR and MBCT to see whether it can improve the cognitive functioning in older adults. Unfortunately, we're still in the early stage. There's only 3 randomized control trials, 1 waitlist, 1 psychoeducation, so not many are comparing to the active control. And I was working with the elderly geriatricians with some funding called Joyful Hong Kong from a DH, and we are training mindfulness for elderly people to improve their well-being. So I hope to have the results in 2 years' time. But there's some of these studies that there's no control group, small sample size. Some of them are positive, but the only study with a large sample size didn't show much result. So basically we don't know yet, and we need to see more. Caregivers, we know people who are looking after people who are old, who are disabling, are very, very stressful. And I see a lot of these people in clinic that the person who suffer have depression and physical disorders, and the people looking after them have depression. And very unfortunately in Hong Kong, these are the people, a lot of time is single women who are almost being automatically assigned by the family to look after people. And we need help, we need support for these population. So a few years ago, actually quite a few years ago, in 2010, we were funded by the RCID from the government to use MBSR to recruit caregivers. So you give them 8 weeks of intervention compared to you just give them pamphlet to read, okay? And it's a bit of a weak control, I would say. And initially, people asked, well, they would never ever go to MBSR because they're so busy looking after that. So I got criticized. But we did. When we involve the NGOs, we have the Hong Kong Rehab Society help to work together. So again, working together, you get farther, which is true. So in post-intervention, we find that there's a significant improvement in the depressive symptoms. And at 3 months, this improvement continues. So they not only do they improve in depression, they also have improved self-compassion and self-efficacy in helping with the significant others with significant physical disorders. So it could be one of the things that we can think about to give someone. And this is the group that we had with the gathering. So before I end, I want to bring you to oncology, cancer. So when you look at the cancer literature, there's actually not many studies, but there's a qualitative study where I want to highlight that often, I think we as people who do research, we often look at the quantitative, We want the significant result, but rarely do we see qualitative, how you change a person. Often very hard to capture, and often we neglected that. But I think it's very important spiritually, the how it's done. So I want to show you that this is a study done by Professor Linda Carlson from University of Calgary in Canada. And they do MBSR for people with cancer. Oftentimes, they have breast cancer. And they find that the change is interesting. They find that at the end, in the qualitative research, they find people with cancer are more opening to change. Okay? They find that they have feeling more self-control. They find that their experience are more shared. They're more open about their experience. They find that they have personal growth. A lot of time when we think about cancer patient, terminal cancer, we don't think of growth. But in fact, if you think about that as a person, as a human, then there's room for growth and improvement and change. And they found that there's improved change in spirituality, which I find is very important. So they said, the healing has elevated me to a higher level of recognizing this program as beneficial. No matter what, it changed my outlook on life, my relationship to other people, and most importantly, my relationship to myself. That's the one person I have to deal with every day. And this is from one of the quotes from the participants. I think they develop wisdom, actually. That is, so when you look at all these religions and philosophy, there's an underlying common current among all of them. The biggest problem with the world is that they are concentrated on each other differences. I think they have all these addiction problem, widespread. And when you get addicted, you only see the difference. You don't see the commonality. And you don't see the humanity. So they concentrate on each other's differences instead of the common ground. This is from a cancer patients who initially might not think that way, but they develop the wisdom after the program. So in summary, I think the strong evidence, if you look at it scientifically, is for recurrent major depressions. We need more studies with active control for the other health problems. And I think we need to work together because we can never achieve the sample size that is required to get the evidence. So we need to summarize them together and to work together to collect them such that you get a huge database. And I think we should work into the compliance and some of the predictors. So who are the people who might work the best for mindfulness intervention? Because I think it's not for everyone. Or maybe at that time in their life, it might not be for them. So we cannot force them. But what we can is to plant the seed. And I'm sure with the right conditions, the seed will grow. So with that, I need to thank you and also thank you for our Mindfulness Research Center for some shameless promotion. And I need to thank all of the people who I work with, who I learn a lot. And thank you again for inviting me here today. I've learned a lot from the lectures from the previous speakers. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Wong, for your very lively presentation. So now we'll have a lunch break, and there will be 4 more presentations in the afternoon. The session will begin again at 1:30. So see you again after lunch. Thank you.